Hello and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris. Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. Myanmar went to the polls recently on December 28th. It was the first round of the military junta's contentious three-phased elections. It was the first vote of the military-run country since the 2021 coup. Now, 2 more rounds of voting are set for January 11th and January 25th. How do we make sense of what's happening in Myanmar right now? Joining me on the line is Debbie Stothard, who is the founder of the democracy advocacy group Alternative ASEAN Network on Burma. Debbie, thank you so much for joining us on the show. The junta is saying that these elections are actually a pathway to reconciliation and democracy. And I'm just wondering, from a perspective of democracy and human rights, what do you believe the elections are designed to achieve?
Well, the military junta held this started the coup in February 2021 to overturn the results of the November 2020 general election, in which Aung San Suu Kyi's National League for Democracy won by a landslide. And the head of the army, Min Aung Hlaing, launched that coup because Aung San Suu Kyi would refuse to make him the president. So this is really a one man's toxic masculinity taking over the whole country. But having said that, the junta did not expect to face such strong resistance. In fact, even today, more than half of the country's territory is under resistance control. So in order to offset this loss of territory, the junta is trying to use the election to give itself some legitimacy because they don't have control on the ground. So they're trying to offset this loss of territory with an election. But I think the numbers are very telling. Basically, the parties that represent the key stakeholders, the ethnic political parties and the National League for Democracy, were dissolved. They were wiped out and not allowed, and therefore couldn't run in this very stacked election. And on December 28th, the first phase of voting was for 102 townships, 102 constituencies. And out of that number, the USDP, the Union Solidarity and Development Party, the junta's proxy, won 88% of the seats out of 102. So 88 seats out of 102. And you must understand that those seats were actually won by the NLD. 89 seats were won by the NLD in 2020. So what they've done is that they've tried to they literally wiped out the opposition and put in place their own party. So the USDP won only 8 seats in 2020 out of the 102 townships that were voted on December 28th. And by wiping out the NLD and the ethnic parties, they managed to take over 88 seats.
Wow.
So it's pretty clear. But I think from an ASEAN perspective, and I think from a human perspective, December 28th, which was the polling day, also was the day that the military launched 20 attacks, artillery attacks and airstrikes on mainly civilian targets throughout the country. I mean, in the week of the voting, we had rest stops for drivers and restaurants being bombed with airstrikes where scores of people died. We had a family watching television in Arakan State basically killed by an airstrike. We had it was quite shocking to see the number of fatalities. There's nearly 100 people have died in the weeks around the first phase of voting. So the junta didn't even stop the violence for polling. So this is quite shocking. But I think from an ASEAN perspective, where the junta is trying to say with this election, we can go back to business as usual. It's quite shocking to also see that the main parties that were allowed to run under the military junta actually are very thin on economic policies. The parties that were trying to take advantage of the vacuum created by the NLD's absence, they were hoping to grab some seats there. They didn't actually make much inroad. So that's basically the situation.
Debbie, you said the parties that were allowed to run. Can you tell us more about how this, who can contest in these elections are being tightly controlled?
Basically, we saw that parties that were willing to follow the rules of the military junta, who did not actually question the military junta's actions and policies, parties that basically were willing to comply with some very oppressive rules and regulations set up by the junta's Union Election Commission, and parties that didn't criticize the election were allowed to run. And let's not forget, in the past few weeks, we've had young people sentenced to 49 years jail simply for sticking up posters criticizing the election.
Wow. Can you tell us about the conditions on the ground? I mean, what do we know? Do we have any sense of how ordinary Myanmar citizens view these elections? Are they participating? Is there fear? Is there resistance? Is there an opportunity to boycott? What do we know about the security conditions of being allowed to vote?
Well, the reports we got from friends on the ground, especially around the Rangoon area, said that they had to pass many military checkpoints. There's been a lot of checkpoints set up in the past few years, but this time the soldiers and the police at those checkpoints were demanding their voter registration number to prove that they were registered to vote. People were the junta officials went from house to house to remind people to vote because there was a very low voter turnout. Actually, it's quite shocking to see what a stark contrast it was to the voter turnout in 2020, where downtown, most of the polling stations downtown were quite crowded. In this case, we saw photos and footage of very, very few people going out to vote. What we saw was threats against people, that people in the border areas, if they needed a border pass to cross into Thailand or China to do their trading, they would not be able to get it unless they showed that they had voted. Young people were told, if you want to study or you want to travel, if you want to fly out the country, you have to show that you voted before they'll let you out. So people were being pushed to even register for advanced voting in order to be able to leave the country. So what we saw was a lot of young people who were hoping to leave the country to study or get a job, they felt a lot of pressure that they had to vote. Whereas ordinary people who didn't want to travel, who didn't feel that they had much of a business opportunity, a lot of them stayed home.
You also mentioned a bit earlier, Debbie, that there are large parts of the country that are controlled by the resistance. So talk to us, tell us a little bit, how are polls being conducted in those areas?
Most of the spaces have been actually subjected to military attack rather than in polling. In some pockets, the military has been able to wrest control through a lot of fighting to try and set up some kind of polling station. But generally, most of the people in these resistance-controlled areas are doing life as normal. They still, on high alert, going to their bunkers if there are planes or drones in the sky. They're still setting up their political systems and running local administrations without any help from the military. I think for many of these people, the biggest threat is military attack and military blockading humanitarian supplies.
So we see that that ASEAN has been quite vague in terms of how it is trying to respond to these elections in the three phases in the two upcoming phases as well that will be happening later this month. How do you think the international community as well, particularly ASEAN, should respond to these elections in terms of engagement, sending observers, or even recognizing the results?
I think the problem with these elections is that the local people, even people in military-controlled areas, are refusing to vote in the election. So that's why we've had people on the ground feeling very surprised that despite all the threats and intimidation, people who've been able to avoid voting haven't turned up to the polling station. So the military junta claiming more than 50% of the country turned up is not the case. Secondly, even in areas where under resistance control, the military actually they suspended voting in 63 townships. These are the townships under martial law. And there's up to 7.6 million people of voting age in those areas. So when we talk about a martial law being imposed on these areas outside of the junta's control, where people are being targeted with violence, that's representing pretty much half the number of people who voted in the last Malaysian general election. It's like almost all of the voters in Semenanjung just being excluded. That's basically what the situation is.
That's shocking, Debbie, when you put it in that perspective, in the Malaysian context. You mentioned at the start of our conversation that the military junta is hoping that these elections is a return to business as usual. What is the fear, the danger of these elections being used to legitimize this military regime?
The military is really hungry for revenue. They've been relying on conflict extraction, basically natural resource extractions in mainly conflict-affected areas, and forcing farmers to export rice when the price of rice is nearly 400% domestically of pre-coup period. So this is actually, and they've been actually also imposing sanctions to block imports from other parts of the world, from neighboring countries, without actually having local alternatives. So the junta is very, very hungry for revenue. They apparently, it's been estimated that they spent $5 billion on weapons and ammunition alone in 2024. So they really are hoping that there will be greater investor confidence. And we're not just talking about investor confidence in terms of foreign or regional investment. Local business people have actually moved their capital into the region and other parts of the world. So we've seen that economic boom in Thailand and to a certain extent Singapore, where people moved their money and started buying up property in neighboring countries, because they really, even if they are apolitical and even if they are friendly with the junta, they still don't trust the junta's economic policies. Right. So the main thing is about trying to convince the international community to come back and do business in Burma, so that the military is not starved. We must understand that many people traditionally join the military for economic opportunities. That's been the tradition. And many of the main corporations like Myanmar Economic Corporation, Union of Myanmar Economic Holdings, etc., are owned and dominated by military. So the way the junta leader, Min Aung Hlaing, has conducted this violence has really hurt the economic activities of the country, and it's really hurting the military as well.
Right. Debbie, thank you so much for sharing those insights with us. I appreciate your time. Debbie Stothard there from Alternative ASEAN Network on Burma. We're going to take a quick break here and consider this. We'll be back with more. Stay tuned. Hi, welcome back to Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris. Myanmar's main pro-military party is claiming an overwhelming lead in the first phase of elections in the country, which is being overseen by the military junta. Now, this comes amid human rights groups warning that the vote is structured to legitimize continued military control. So joining me on the show now to continue our discussion about this topic is Dr Moe Thuzar, who's a senior fellow and coordinator of the Myanmar Studies Programme at ISEAS-Yusof Ishak Institute in Singapore. Moe, thank you so much for joining me on the show to discuss this. So the first phase of the elections has just been concluded. Can you talk us through your observations of how the first phase went?
Thank you, Melissa, for having me on the program. It's good to pick up the conversation. As you observed earlier, the dominant pro-military or the military proxy or allied political party, the Union Solidarity and Development Party, has shown or has taken a very strong, people are saying decisive lead in this first of three phased elections in Myanmar, organized by the current military regime, the State Security and Peace Commission. So this was, I think, to be expected in the sense that this is an exercise. This election exercise is something that the military regime has tried to structure to gain as much advantage as it can for its continued longevity in the country's political life. So reading as you are the results that have been announced by the Union Election Commission appointed by the regime. Again, the USDP, the Union Solidarity and Development Party, it's swept like over 90% of the lower house seats. And the ethnic political parties have picked up some seats, I think, in the areas that they are competing nationwide. But, you know, it's nothing comparable to the USDP's wins, which are also in the regional and state assembly level as well as the national level. And I think the few civilian political parties that did compete for seats did not fare well at all. So we have to, I guess, extrapolate to what the second and third stages may yield. But I think this is pretty much going as how the military wanted to plan the exercise.
Right. Mo, is it typical for elections to be held in this way, having it staggered in such a manner, having three different phases of elections? I'm just wondering what you hypothesize the rationale to be.
Right. It's interesting, and that's a very important point here, Melissa, because in Myanmar's recent political contemporary history, of course, there is no such instance. It's always been a nationwide exercise, first past the post. The only other historical precedent, if you will, was for the 1951-1952 general election in what was then called Burma. And the rationale that was used then was also domestic instability due to some ethnic armed organizations resisting against central rule at that time. And of course, the then ruling authorities used this as the reason to stagger the elections. And I think this may have been some kind of political or historical parallel, I should say, that the current regime might have had in mind. However, there are differences. You know, this current exercise, we're seeing an introduction of a kind of like a mixed member representation system, which is very new for for Burma or Myanmar throughout history, it's always been first past the post, but now we're seeing an introduction of a mix of first past the post plus proportional representation based on a specific calculation. So that adds, I think, to some of the new but not new kind of characteristics of this current exercise.
Okay, so how should the international community, and here I think I would zoom it to ASEAN in particular, how do you think these bodies should interpret the elections and the results of all phases?
Right. We are still waiting for, I think, 2 more phases to be completed, although extrapolating from this first phase, I guess, and even before, the kind of expectations or calculations are pretty much clear that this is something that the current regime wants to push through as a kind of election as transition process. After the phases are complete, then Parliament will convene, and it is the Parliamentary Electoral College that will elect the executive, who will be president, who will be vice president, and so on. So what happens next, who will be in the executive, of course, may determine actions from external interlocutors. There are some within this region who, of course, are looking to somehow seek to pursue their interests with Naypyidaw and expecting that this current exercise might lead to what they view as, some kind of stability or predictability. But at this point in time, of course, it's really hard to come down and say this or that will happen because there are different scenarios. Of course, it could be just things continue as they were, with maybe just a change in the setup, but very much the same kind of intention and direction continues. This is what we might call the base scenario, with some kind of incremental steps. Of course, there are those who are looking at this current exercise as potentially leading to some kind of opening 2.0, like we saw in the past decade, and using that as an argument to kind of go along at face value with this exercise. That's, of course, what they are hoping would be, quote unquote, the best case scenario. But of course, with the country still amidst conflict, ongoing conflict, and a civil war situation in several parts of the country, there could easily also be interpretations about what I hope may not take place, but a worst case scenario of escalating violence and pushback. And why I say this is because the resistance members, of course, are still very much determined in voicing their concerns.
Right. Okay, can you maybe elaborate some of those concerns and whether they are shared by observers or researchers like yourself, especially in the wake of what we would expect the results to be?
Right. Yeah. The resistance have made it very clear that they oppose these elections, and it's not shutting the door on dialogue. Actually, the resistance has made it clear also to, I think, ASEAN interlocutors that they are not close to dialogue, but there are certain circumstances and parity that needs to happen if there is to be dialogue. So even if a new administration that emerges out of this election exercise is going to take up the dialogue proposal, hypothetically, potentially, the resistance has, I think, made it clear that they would want that new administration to comply with, or at least consider, some of its key demands. And the main demands that they have, the resistance groups, of course, it's very similar to ASEAN's 5-point consensus as well. They want an end to the violence. They want all key political prisoners to be released. there are several, including senior leaders from the previous administration and senior political party leaders still behind bars. So they want the release of political prisoners. And I think since 2021, after the coup, the resistance groups have also made it very clear that they would like to see the military withdrawing from politics. And since 5 years ago, and as a result of all the violence and atrocities that have happened, I think there is also a sense that they want to seek some kind of truth-telling or justice. So, these are their broad demands. I'm summarizing. But at this point in time, knowing that the military, of course, is very intent on pushing through this exercise to meet its own political aims and objectives, I'm not too sure whether any administration emerging from these elections might consider all these demands in a favorable light. Right. So that's my summary of the resistance broad demands. Now, you asked me about researchers, right? I mean, we tend to be a bit boring. As researchers, we try to monitor the mood in the country. And it's not just us. There are other research and monitoring entities with track records on monitoring, tracking pre-election sentiments and so on. And some of those exercises have reflected there's this deep skepticism towards political parties competing in the elections. And I think the feeling in the country domestically really is that the parties that are participating in the in these current election exercises do not really represent people's desires and aspirations. I think broadly people still want to see the goals of a federal democratic union emerge as a desirable political system, but I think people in the country are also quite realistic that this may not materialize in the near future. And so I think there's this kind of skeptical type of feeling in our own kind of qualitative monitoring that we've done. I think it kind of tracks the other polls that we've read and monitored. I think domestically, a lot of people are just resigned to the elections proceeding. And there is a doubt whether these current exercise, these elections, or a new government emerging from the process could effectively address the country's political and economic challenges. And I think there is also an element of skepticism based from the key informant conversations that we've had about whether even that, repeat of the reform process that we saw in the past decade, there's a bit of skepticism about that as well, that, we might not see such a repeat happening. And so we see that, but domestically also, there are people who are fatigued, hoping for an end to the violence because of all this ongoing conflict affecting their lives in different ways. And of course, the ordinary people who are weary of the strain of coping with the increasing socioeconomic hardships and so on. Those with imprisoned family members would, of course, hope for an amnesty post-election. We've just heard about the amnesty that coincided with Myanmar's Independence Day yesterday.
Right.
So however imperfect all of this is, I think this is the kind of sentiments that we're trying to monitor domestically.
Right.
Of course, the military regime has been capitalizing on such sentiments.
Yeah, definitely. Moe, thank you so much for sharing some of those insights. I appreciate your time. Dr. Moe Thuzar there from the ISEAS-Yusof Ishak Institute, wrapping up this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris, signing off for the evening. Thank you so much for watching, and good night.